Thank you for joining Jennifer Schaus and Associates in our 2019 Webinar Wednesday series. We are coming to you live from downtown Washington, D.C. Our webinars are every Wednesday, and you can find the upcoming schedule on our website. Past webinars and all recordings are also on our website and on our YouTube channel, along with over 160 other recordings on federal contracting topics. All are complimentary. If you have questions for our speaker today, you can email him directly at the phone number or email shown on the last slide. All right, this is just a little bit about us. We are a Washington, D.C. based firm and provide services to federal contractors. This ranges from market analysis reports to proposal writing and also post-award compliance. More information is on our website, so please visit us there. We do offer advertising in a newsletter, so you can email this email if you'd like more information on that. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Michael Gallo is going to be our speaker today, and he's going to be covering proposal cost volume, common pitfalls. Thank you for joining us today, Michael, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thank you, Mallory. Today we're going to talk about common pitfalls. On a previous webinar, we talked about best practices. Now we're going to move into what happens when we don't adopt those best practices. What are some of the issues we find then when the government ultimately evaluates your cost proposal? What are some of the common pitfalls that are found? Let's go ahead and go to the next slide then. And let's just briefly recap. So in a previous webinar on cost volume best practices, we first talked about the comparison between what's the nature of the cost volume in comparison to the nature of the technical volume. And I want to briefly recap that. First, there isn't one cost volume submission. There's typically several because on larger bids, subcontractors usually have to submit a cost volume as well. And you can double your fund if you have to provide both redacted and unredacted subcontractor cost and pricing volumes because of the issue of proprietary subcontractor cost and pricing data. You don't get evaluated, you don't earn a grade. Let's say when your cost volume is evaluated, you don't get an A, B, C, D, or E, or F. Your cost volume is evaluated to determine if the government believes your price is that is neither too high, meaning that it's reasonable, and that it's not too low, meaning that you have a realistic price. So you'll never hear the government say, that's a great cost volume. Let's go ahead and give this offer the contractor award. But you absolutely, if you don't prepare this right, you might lose the contract award because of faults in your cost volume. So let's review some of the common pitfalls that might plague your cost volume. Next slide. So the first pitfall, the cost volume details don't match technical volume details, and this is a very common issue. And let me give you an example. You priced and documented in your cost volume 100 personnel for the proposed contract. However, when the evaluators reviewed the staffing plan within the technical volume, that staffing plan showed 105 personnel. And your cost volume didn't address in the narrative this apparent discrepancy of 5 missing persons. Aha, the government says you've omitted some staffing, and since this is a cost type contract, we the government are going to upwardly adjust your price to probable cost to reflect these 5 missing staff. Now your adjusted price is higher than your competitors, and you're no longer considered the best value, and guess what? You lose. So this problem usually pops up because of last minute changes that have been made to pricing that were neither flowed back into the cost volume itself, and more importantly, wasn't flowed back into the technical volume to ensure that the two volumes match for consistency. But the key remedy here is to start your pricing and solution earlier in the process so that your pricing gets locked down sooner, and you hopefully will avoid these types of last minute changes. I'll also add that sometimes the issue of missing persons, and this example is actually explainable. Maybe these personnel are captured as consultants and are included elsewhere in your pricing, but because your pricing narrative didn't fully explain these consultants and how they map to your overall staffing, the government's now not sure why they might be missing, and they have now surmised that you've in fact omitted them. So the lesson here would be to clearly document your costs and assumptions. Next slide. So just as you can have a mismatch between costs and technical volumes, you can also have a similar mismatch going on between the subcontractor pricing and what the prime contractor is showing. The example here would be in the case where subcontractors have to submit their pricing data directly to the government, in addition to submitting it to the prime. The bottom line price or details that the government sees in that subcontractor submission doesn't match the bottom line price and details that are seen that's included in the prime contractor's proposal, the prime's representation of the subcontractor's costs in the prime's proposal. So same as before, when the government evaluates the situation, if what the subcontractor told the government directly is higher than what the prime is representing for that subcontractor in the prime submission, the government is going to upwardly adjust it if it's a cost type contract to a probable cost that ends up being higher than what you proposed and higher than what your other competitors might have bid. And again, you run the risk of losing the competition. Again, this is almost always an issue of either last minute changes made by the prime or the sub that didn't get rolled into the prime's pricing, or it's some sort of misunderstanding between the prime and the sub about what's supposed to be priced. Either way, the best way to ensure consistency is to provide pricing templates to the subcontractors that contain pre-formatted, sanitized output that can be sent directly to the prime. And so this output in the template is directly connected to underlying details in the template to show the subcontractors detailed calculations, but those detailed calculations aren't exposed to the prime. The subcontractor just sends out the sanitized output. All that detail, of course, will be disclosed by the subcontractor to the government. But by taking the time to provide a good template, you help ensure that the bottom line subcontractor price that the government sees is going to be the same bottom line subcontractor price that the prime is representing in the prime's bid. Next slide. So this next pitfall is incomplete cost volume narrative, and this can be a more nuanced issue. So let's take an example. The government has requested offers to provide documentation and explanation to explain their rates. And let's say we have an incumbent who has the contract and it's a recompete, and now they're recompeting to get the follow-on contract. And let's say in this case, the government has asked all for this rate detail, but the prime feels that the government already knows them. They don't need to provide all that detail. They should already know the basis for those rates, and that those rates are good. And so they provide a glib explanation of their rates and the cost volume. Maybe perhaps though, just so happens on this particular bid, the incumbent proposed much lower rates than their current contract, and they fail to explain the basis of those lower rates to the government and why they should believe those new lower rates when the government has a clear track record of costs from the legacy contract that show higher rates. You can see what would be happen here if the bidder did not provide an adequate explanation in their cost volume document. The government is not convinced, and they think the incumbent is lowballing the bid, and they will upwardly adjust those rates, again, if this is a cost type contract, to match the incumbent's actual cost history. So the moral here is clear. Don't assume the government knows you, even if you're the incumbent, and provide the information requested. Ensure that your cost volume narrative is written to the extent that a stranger that's not familiar with your company can understand your pricing. Next slide. So here's another similar issue here with missing information. And let me give you another real world example of what I mean here. So we had an RFP that required the primes to provide documentation of the prime's evaluation of their subcontractors' proposed pricing. And that evaluation had to include documentation of how the prime found the subcontractor's pricing fair and reasonable. And in this particular example case, this particular RFP, the contracting officer actually spelled out the kinds of information that constituted how the prime evaluated the subcontractor's proposed pricing, and the contracting officer made a material requirement in the RFP to submit this information. And the issue there is failure to comply with a material requirement is grounds for your proposal getting dropped from the competitive range or not even getting the contract award. So one of the primes here included basically a superficial sentence. They responded to the requirement with a superficial statement that was copied and pasted multiple times, one for each subcontractor, that basically said, and I'm almost saying this verbatim, they said, we reviewed the subcontractor's pricing and found it reasonable. And that's all they said. And the contracting officer ultimately rejected the proposal on the grounds that they did not comply with the RFP instructions. Why does this happen? Now, in this case, you have to think that this particular contractor understood that this was a material requirement, yet they failed to provide the government what they asked for. And you know, many times missing information comes from the fact that we're all busy, and so we end up trying to reuse whatever we can from our previous proposals, trying to reuse content from previous bids to save some time, and that's a good thing. However, I urge caution. You need to make sure you build a cost volume compliance matrix that we talked about previously in the best practices presentation. You need to build one of those for each proposal separately. And I strongly recommend you don't reuse the compliance matrix. You build each one from scratch. Double check and flag any reused cost volume content that you're bringing into your new bid, and make sure you flag any content that doesn't fully comply with this RFP's requirement, and identify and specify the gap of information that's missing. If you do this, it will help ensure that you're going to submit a complete and compliant cost volume. I'm going to move on to some final thoughts now on the next slide. There's a common theme that runs across all these problems and pitfalls that we've discussed here in this presentation today. And it becomes what I regard really as the number one pitfall, and that pitfall is time. We are starting our pricing efforts too late, and we're not providing enough budget in terms of time and money to fund the proposal development. And as a consequence, we're cutting too many corners, and we're doing things too much at the last minute, and things are getting dropped and lost in the process. We need to take the time to understand what the customer wants, what we are bidding, how we bring those resources together to deliver the solution, where those resources will come from, and when those resources will be provided, and you know, why those resources are needed in the first place. The answers to these questions start early in the capture process during the sources sought stage. Then as we move through the capture process, we clarify and better define and price our solution during the RFP stage, and we follow through during post-award to make sure we understand how and why we won or lost the bid, so that those lessons learned can inform our next proposal. I want to leave you with a closing thought. The famous general Sun Tzu said, quote, "Every battle is won or lost before it's ever fought," unquote. And I believe the same is true for pricing, that every contract is won or lost before it's ever bid. So make sure you're reserving enough time and resources to plan and strategize your next proposal pricing and the documentation that goes along with it. Thank you for attending today's webinar. Mallory, I turn it over to you.